This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. A quick reminder that you can interact with the podcast by sending me a voicemail and potentially be on one of the future episodes of the Graceful Atheist Podcast. The links will be in the show notes. Let me know what you think. On to today's episode. My guest today is Lisa. She goes by Secular Sobriety on Twitter. Lisa also has a YouTube channel called How Not to Be an Asshole. Lisa and I discuss the parallels between deconversion and recovery from substance abuse, while telling her story of experiencing both of these things simultaneously. Lisa lives up to the ethos of the podcast, which is an honesty contest. As anyone who is in recovery understands, you have to be honest with yourself in order to overcome those addictions. I found Lisa on YouTube where she did a video about honesty from a recovery point of view, and I was so struck by how important a value, a humanistic value, that is. Lisa also has a video on the 12 steps and how they apply to life in general, not just substance abuse recovery. I am very interested in talking about the humanistic values that are embedded in the 12 steps. And as I admit, there's also a lot of pseudo-Christianity or a pseudo-religious idea in the 12 steps, but that doesn't mean there aren't some elements there that are really valuable, and that's what Lisa and I discuss here. We also discuss the secular alternatives to 12-step programs, including Secular Organizations for Sobriety, or SOS, and SMART Recovery. We'll have links to those in the show notes. I'll note here that in our discussion, I refer to this intro as having told a personal story, and I've actually decided to put that in the final thoughts section at the end of the podcast. So please hang on for that personal story of how the 12 steps impacted me and my life, both within my Christianity and now as a humanist. And now I give you Lisa on Secular Sobriety. Lisa, welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate the invite.
All right. So you go by the moniker on Twitter, Secular Sobriety.
Right.
And so your story involves really going through a deconversion process while you were in AA, if I understand correctly. Can you tell us about maybe your life before that, and then we'll get into the depth of that process?
Sure. You know, I came from a family that I actually thought I had a pretty good childhood, and I grew up Catholic, but I didn't, looking back on it now and being a relatively new atheist, it was relatively a liberal form of Catholicism. I think there's a lot of things that my parents probably wouldn't be comfortable telling me even now as far as what their thought processes were. I am the youngest of four, and now that I'm in my upper 40s, I feel as though it's become clear to me that I probably was an accident. So they were like, oh, what are we going to do? And,
surprise baby.
Right.
Yeah.
And being Catholic, of course, there's different repercussions, and I think there were different options to them that they perhaps thought out, and it is what it is. But all in all, I feel like I had a pretty good childhood, and to kind of put some puzzle pieces together that some people may be interested in, is that no one in my immediate family that I know of is an addict, whether to alcohol or drugs or anything.
Okay.
I do have a sibling who is morbidly obese, but it's not for me to judge, whether that's an issue for her.
Right. My story, just again, I mentioned that in the intro, I tell just a little bit about myself, but my entire family, like in every direction, they were either super hard drinkers or full blown addicts. Right. I have a recovering aunt. My mother was recovering for a brief period of time in her life. She went back to her disease, unfortunately. But yeah, I mean, just everyone in my family drank pretty heavily.
Wow.
So my rebellion was, I'm not going to drink.
Right. How long did that last?
It lasted all my life. I'm the most vanilla, boring person you can possibly imagine. I don't drink. I've never done
Oh,
drugs.
good for
You know,
you.
so
Okay, I didn't
yeah,
realize that.
I'm sure it's really irritating to my friends.
It's hilarious. That is hilarious. Oh my
Yeah.
gosh. Yeah, I definitely feel like the black sheep of the family in many ways. But yeah, so when I was going to AA in particular, um,
Mm-hmm.
and going around those circles of people, I really felt like, I don't know, at least 50% of them started drinking when they were teenagers. Um,
Mm-hmm.
that was not me, and I'm not saying it's an extraordinary story, but yeah, I really didn't. I think I never really saw my parents drink. I never really felt like they were not Baptists where they actually would actively tell you don't ever drink or you'll go to hell.
Right.
Uh,
Right.
because being Catholic, we joke, of course, that's like part of it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, so when I was a kid, I can think of them drinking a couple times a year, maybe at holidays, and maybe when we would go out to dinner, which was extremely rare back then.
Mm-hmm.
And they would let me take a sip, and it was nice. It was, when it was mixed with something, it was nice.
Yeah.
Whiskey sour or whatever was popular
Yeah.
back then.
So let me circle back just
Sure.
briefly, just make sure I cover all of our bases. So as an adult, did you consider yourself a practicing Catholic, or would you say kind
No,
of
no, yeah,
nominal?
that I can touch on that a little bit. Right around the time I guess it was graduating high school and then getting into college is when I really said, look, there's a lot of things going on in the Catholic Church that I don't like. Certainly the pedophilia issue that had finally been raised in the early 90s, which was around the time I had graduated. And then I was becoming a bit of a feminist at that time, so I was very upset that women didn't have a bigger role, that priests weren't allowed to marry, several other things that just really bothered me about the Catholic Church. And so I said to myself, am I really a Catholic if I don't like this, and this?
Right.
And I
Yeah.
don't support those things, so what, does that really count? So that's around the time I just stopped going to
Hmm.
church. At the time, I chose not to really explore anything else.
Okay. Okay.
And I just kind of floated around for a while. And then it just so happens that right around that time, I started experimenting with alcohol around 20 or 21.
Hmm.
I worked actually in a microbrewery around the time I was 19 or 20. And I remember one night distinctly, I was underage, but I was close. Like I think I might have been 20, and one of
Yeah.
the bartenders poured me a dark beer that the microbrewery brewed
Yeah.
into a coffee mug so that it looked like it was coffee.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
he said, here, try this. And it wasn't the first time I had had beer, but it's my drinking career at that point had been touch and go. I had tried
Hmm.
it and then I had let it go. I wasn't one of the folks where you said, you had it for the first time and you fell instantly in love. That wasn't my experience. I mean, I liked it.
Right.
Beer was, it's an
Yeah.
acquired
Yeah.
taste.
Yes. Yeah. Definitely is.
It
Yeah.
smells great, but then when you taste it, you're like, what?
Yeah.
But anyway, so yeah,
I can hear my British friends jumping up and down right now.
yeah. Liquid bread is what I associate
Right.
with this.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I would go back and forth a little bit. It really depended on the crowd I was running with at the time. At some point, I was waiting tables at a restaurant, and if you know anything about that culture, it's like it's almost as if you're making your I mean, at least in your 20s, you're making your
Uh-huh.
tips just to have beer money.
Right.
And that's what we would do, is on a Friday or Saturday night after our shift, we would go out and drink. I eventually fell out with that crowd, for whatever reason. I graduated college or whatnot.
Yeah.
And then I dated a guy who was not a big drinker. So sometimes we would drink when we went out, but sometimes not. And it wasn't a big deal to me at the time. I didn't really care. I don't know. It's not something that I hung my hat on at that particular moment. And he was brought up religious, possibly Baptist, but there was nothing forced on me. There was nothing, it's not like we talked about God or anything like that. But there's definitely those, like I said, the crowds that you hang with. It just depends on who I was around at the time.
Yeah. When did you start to notice that there might be a problem?
Believe it or not, my late 30s.
Okay.
I remember, I met my who ended up being my husband, and he liked to drink. And I remember liking that about him, that he liked to drink. So maybe, that's a clue, even though I wasn't dependent on it at that particular time. And I think even at that time, I said to myself, I haven't become addicted yet, so maybe I'm just not that type of person. And that's, I think I kind of wrote it off.
Yeah. And maybe we should stop very quickly here to say that we are not teetotalers telling other people that they shouldn't drink. But I think maybe if you could just speak to that, there is a difference between a social drinker, even a heavy social drinker, and someone who finds themselves in addiction. You want me to speak to that briefly?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll be honest, and I don't for sure know the difference between a heavy drinker and someone who's an addict, except that a heavy drinker, number one, might not obsess about it during the day. For me, for example, when I finally did become addicted, I look forward to 5 o'clock rolling around and making it okay to indulge. And then, of course, the other thing is that a heavy drinker may be able to put it down at some point during the evening and be okay with that. Whereas those of us who become addicted, once we start, we don't want to stop until we're passed out or sleep.
Right.
So those, I think, are the two main differences. I'll be honest, I can't think of anyone in my life who's been a heavy drinker, but
yeah. And again, when I say, like, in my family, there are lots of heavy drinkers, I think many of them are on that bleeding edge of whether or not they're addicts. I find, because my particular part in this story, if you're familiar with, for the listeners, if they're familiar with, kind of the family hero role is kind of the part that I played. And part of my kind of becoming an adult and pulling away from that was recognizing that it's really not my job to determine who's an addict and who's not, and to let that go. Right. So, and that was something I had to work on.
Yeah. That's a really good point. Walking away from being judgmental and controlling, to stand up for yourself and say, here's my boundary.
Right.
You do what you want to do. However, just be aware that this is my boundary. That's got to be really tough. And I can totally see in my family folks who just didn't want to learn that.
Right.
Went to Al-Anon a couple times and decided it wasn't for them. And that's fine. Just be aware that I'm on my own journey, so to speak. And, I may be doing things that you deem uncomfortable.
Yes. Yeah.
And we could get into that a little bit later, because I have some family members who I don't think are too happy with me right now.
I can imagine, and again, I don't think that the listeners who, if you didn't grow up in a family that had addiction as a problem, you might not recognize that when the person who's identified as the problem drinker gets clean and sober, that does not mean that everything is fine after that. In fact, everything can get turned upside down at that point, because the family system has just been completely disrupted. So you can have a lot of problems after the person who was the drinker gets clean and sober.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, so I married my husband. He was a drinker. He still is a drinker. I don't consider him an alcoholic. I think that, he has one or two and that's enough for him and he's good.
Yeah.
There was a point where I was drinking heavily and I felt like he was trying to keep up with me. Whether it was this macho thing, I don't know, but definitely felt like that was part of it. And then finally he's like, I just don't enjoy this anymore. I don't enjoy, having 3 and 4 and 5, and I was like, I do. So what had happened was we got married in 03, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And I had my son in 06, and then 08 rolled around.
Mm-hmm.
And the stock market crashed. And unfortunately, he was a general contractor specializing in new construction.
Oh, no.
And I was his realtor.
Oh, wow.
So that really devastated us financially. And I remember saying to myself, don't drink over this.
Yeah.
And it worked. I want to say it worked for a year or two.
Mm-hmm.
At some point, I think around 2010, I got a part-time job at Panera, and I hated every minute of it, but it was just to earn some extra money. I was very perhaps pretentious about, I have a college degree and I have such and such years of marketing experience and I can't believe I'm working here,
Yeah.
And so there's some of beating up on yourself, even though it was the market. I mean,
Right.
it was an unusual situation. We've had recessions before, but not that severe.
And millions of people were affected in certain ways. Yeah, yeah.
Right, exactly. And so this, I had a bit of a pity party. And the way I remember it anyway, my husband and I would purchase a container of liquor, and I would be at Panera 2, 3, 4 evenings a week, and they would close at 9 p.m. And then we had an hour after that we had to clean up and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then by the time I got home, my excuse would be that I needed at least another hour to wind down.
Yeah.
And so I would take a shot or two of liquor, telling myself that was okay, and that would help me relax more quickly and whatnot. And at first it, wasn't that bad, I guess.
Okay.
I mean, I wouldn't call it healthy. I definitely would call that abuse, but it did help me sleep and that type of thing.
Yeah.
And eventually I'll explain how that's kind of funny because of some sleep problems I had later. But so yeah, I really think that that's where it started. And then of course we would start buying liquor on the weekends, and we would start, getting 24 packs on Friday nights, and, and then, pretty soon it was Thursday through Sunday, and then it was all week long. And it just kind of built from there. And with him drinking with me, I think I was able to hide it a little bit longer than normal.
Right.
Perhaps someone who didn't drink as much, but he still enjoys a beer or two a night. And, that's kind of always the guy that he's been. So
yeah. So what I find fascinating is that there are a number of parallels between recovery from addiction or family systems recovery and this deconversion, deconstruction process, because a lot of it has to do with the human capacity to fool ourselves,
Yes. Excellent point.
to manage a huge amount of cognitive dissonance. And so there's just these very strong parallels. And so I was very fascinated to hear your story because you're going through kind of both of those things simultaneously.
Yeah.
But before we jump ahead, at what point did you start to seek help, and how did the early days of AA work for you?
Sure. So, this doesn't work for everybody. And it was not a quick, clean process, but I believe, spring of 2016 is when I first began my recognition that I definitely have a problem and I've got to address this. My husband called an outpatient facility, and he was basically told what a lot of people are told. There's really not much you can do.
Mm-hmm.
You can pour your heart out to them and tell them how this is hurting you, and that may go 15,000 different ways, but you could just encourage them to check it out. And that's what I did. He gave me the number. He said, call them now, and I did.
Yeah.
And then I started going to intensive outpatient for about 3 months with touch and go results, to be honest. I mean, I stayed dry for about a month, and then I relapsed, and then I kind of was back where I was before. And so April, May, June, so you're talking about, like, let's say July through November, I'm continuing to drink again. I'm picking that up, and so we had another talk and decided, okay, let's consider inpatient.
Okay.
So January 2017, I was at an inpatient facility for 28 days. And, very, very AA focused, very 12-step, religious type focus. And at the time I was on board. So I was like, and I knew a lot of stuff that they had already been talking about. We had classes all day long, and I tried to be respectful and really, learn as much as I could.
Yeah.
And the day I got back, I drank. And it was spotty from there on out. I had already had a sponsor, but then she moved to another state, and then I got a new sponsor, and I really liked how she held my feet to the fire, to be honest.
Okay.
But in the meantime, I'm doing everything that AA wants you to do. The first thing I'm doing is hitting my knees in the morning after I wake up, and I'm praying, and what else? Gosh, I'm doing service work, which I think is great. I think that's a fantastic thing to do when I consider this a certain amount of service work. If someone hears this and is inspired in some way, I could hope that I would help people, which is part of the reason why I'm doing this in the first place, and letting people know, my name is Lisa, and I've got problems. But yeah, so that was touch and go for a while, and then finally around July, a couple things had happened. I had been in a car accident. I didn't get hurt, and it wasn't my fault, and I wasn't drinking.
Okay.
Right. So that was sometime in March, I think, of 2017, and even though I was still sneaking here and there, like that particular night, I had not been drunk or anything like that.
Okay.
So my husband and I shopped for a new car, and the other insurance company finally sends me a check, yada yada yada. Find a car I like. I have the car, I think, about 3 weeks, and I get in another.
Oh no!
And total that one. This time it was my fault, and I had been texting.
Okay. All right.
So to me at the time, I was saying, this is a sign from God. Like this, what else I've been in a couple fender benders in my life, but I'm now in 2 car accidents within 60 days, and they both total my car. Like, what the heck is going on? And neither time I was drinking. So what I kept saying to myself was, this is going to be my life. This is going to be like, if I don't stop drinking, this is what my life is going to be like. I'm going to kill myself, kill someone else. My son was in the car with me the second time, and he's 12 now. And, I just finally had I hate to say, come to Jesus meeting with myself, but
I get it.
I had a time where I was like, if you want, can I cuss?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
If you want to fuck up your life, just keep doing what you're doing. You know, keep drinking, keep driving after you drink. So finally I started paying more attention to what other people were doing and what my sponsor wanted me to do, and so on and so forth. I celebrated a year in July of 2018.
Fantastic.
Thank you. What's weird about that is that June of 2018, well, let me backtrack a tiny bit.
Okay.
I had a job with a property management company. Like I said, I'm a realtor. Because the market had gone south, I wasn't selling as many houses, and I fell into property management because there were people who, there was a good friend of mine who wanted me to sell her house. It had been a year. I couldn't sell it because of the market. And so they said, well, what are our options? And I said, well, I heard that you can try renting it out as a rental and blah, blah, blah. Let's wait until the market gets better. And we kept thinking, oh, next year it'll be better. And it just didn't work out that way. But yeah, I fell into property management. And at one point I had about a dozen properties I was managing by myself.
Okay.
And then a property management company approached me, and I took them up on their offer. Wow. I mean, it was just a mess. At first, I really liked it. I got along with everyone in the office. But here's another part of my personality that I'm still not convinced is not similar to other drinkers, which is I'm hypersensitive. Not as much as I used to be, but I'm still, I consider myself a sensitive person.
Yeah.
And there's just something about me that ends up pissing people off. And I still am not sure. Like, I'm still not 100% sure what that thing is. I feel like I start off strong, and I don't know whether it's it might even be the South. I mean, that's a possibility that, I grew up in New Jersey, and I don't consider myself a brash person, but maybe I say things that just aren't as nuanced as they're used to. I'm not really sure, but I ended up working with a woman whose job I had replaced. The reason why my boss needed someone was because she had left.
Okay.
So then she called my boss again, 6 months or so later, and said she hates her new job. And I guess they were in talks about bringing her back. And I should have known at that point that I was doomed.
Oh, yeah.
She had been with that company for at least 10 years.
Okay.
And I was not.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
So I think it just had to do with my boss couldn't afford me, and long story short, she let me go.
Yeah.
And so January of 2018, I'm just trying to not drink, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
It was pretty easy, but my husband didn't want to ruffle too many feathers. I wasn't doing very much around the house. I was sort of looking for a job, but not really. And then I started, really getting into the internet and looking for stuff. And then I started thinking, well, let's see if I can kind of share my sobriety story with people and, help people that way. And maybe I could start a YouTube channel and help people that way. And I know it's hard. I know it's not as easy as just putting that out there and all of a sudden you're making money. But
yeah.
But that was one of my ideas. And sometime around June of 2018, I started getting these things in my feed from the atheist experience.
Okay. Yeah.
And I know we've kind of made a jump because I haven't really told you about the stuff in between, about how I kind of dabbled with Catholic Light, Episcopalianism, and looking into the Methodist. And my husband was not brought up religious,
right?
But he has a feeling of something, and I had a feeling of something. I thought there was something, and
yeah,
perhaps the closest we could equate that to, now that I know all the terminology. I didn't know the terminology back then, but now that I know the terminology, either deism or pantheism,
sure.
like God is everything, man, you know, and that type of thing. So so right around June, that started happening, and it was the thing that really caught me was the quintessential video that a lot of people see, where Tracy Harris is talking to a guy on the phone, and he was talking about children being molested, and she said, well, the difference between me and your God is that I would try to stop it if I could. Whereas your God would just let it happen and then punish the person later or something like that. And that was compelling, of course. And then I started watching more and more videos, and within a couple weeks, I was like, you know, so I kind of feel like I had been on this path all along, not realizing it. And was really just worried. I was really worried about all these atheists that these famous atheists I started seeing, you know, of course, George Carlin, but, you know, Seth MacFarlane and Bill Maher and various other people, famous people kind of coming out. And I was actually worried about these people coming out as atheists. What's happening, and what's the world coming to, and that type of thing. And then I became one myself. I just could not deny the thought process. And I think what the old me believed was that atheists were just pessimists, you know. That's dumb, you know, and that's it. Well, the truth is that atheists don't have a lot of time to debate their side, right? So these short little clips that you tend to see them in, they're dismissive. But they can't exactly explain their whole side, you know, in a couple of short sentences. It takes more than that. And so that's what really impressed me about atheism, is that most of the people I've seen are extremely thoughtful. I'm always suspicious of someone who says, I used to be an atheist and now I fill in the blank. Because to me, it's just like, it's probably just some kid who was a teenager who thought it was cool, you know, and really didn't give it that much thought. But most of the atheists I'm seeing online anyway are very thoughtful about it. And I just appreciate that so much. And I love the honesty. I love the, you know, you make a mistake and you own up to it. And that's so much like sobriety too.
Exactly. And that's a great segue. That's exactly why I wanted to bring you on, in that I think there are some deeply humanistic values that are embedded in the 12 steps. And I want to explore those. But before we do that, I do want to also acknowledge that also embedded in the 12 steps is very much a pseudo-Christian religion. You know, it's very much about submitting oneself to a theistic God. And so I have to ask, you know, were you worried at all about your sobriety when you started to question the reality of God?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Because, for example, there was one guy in particular. Actually, there was two people in my home group. A home group is where, you know, you can have dozens and dozens of meetings a day in your area, morning, noon, and night. But you may kind of latch on to one particular group, and then you'll call that your home group, and then you get involved in that particular group, whether it's particularly with service work. But, you know, that's kind of the one. And my particular home group, for example, met 3 times a week. Mm-hmm. Well, you know, when I was in early sobriety, I was doing the 90 and 90 thing. So I was going to 90 meetings in 90 days, mm-hmm. which meant I was pretty much going to a meeting every day. And so because my group only met 3 times a week, naturally I was going to other groups. You know, my home group ended up being my favorite. So that's why I kind of settled down there.
While you're starting to recognize you're starting to have doubts about the existence of God, and yet that is really embedded in the 12 steps.
Right.
Were you concerned, and how did you handle that?
Yeah, you know, it's really funny because I'm also on Quora.com, and I do a lot of question and answer about sobriety. Mm-hmm. And there's a distinct difference between my answers before
Yeah.
My deconversion from theism, I really thought, yeah, you can be an atheist and work this program. And to be honest, I definitely think it's possible, but it just, you really just start to take away more and more things when it comes to AA. Some people just don't like it, period. They may be theists, they may not be theists.
Yeah.
But there's something that annoys them. And then you have, relapsers, for example. And so they may go, and then now they're in rehab again, and they come back and whatnot. And, when you talk about percentages, I did this a little while ago, and I wish I could remember the numbers, but, let's say 75% of people with substance abuse problems never get help. Never.
Mm-hmm. Right.
They never admit they have a problem. Maybe they do admit they have a problem, but they say, forget it, I don't care, whatever. They're too far gone, and they drink themselves to death or drug themselves to death.
Right.
And then you have a smaller percentage of people, whatever that number is, who actually seek help. And then within that small group, people will fall off. I can do this myself, whatever. And so you really have a very small percentage of people who go through AA who are lifers, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And there were people there who were lifers. There was one guy who entered AA at 18 and was my age, so he had been doing this for 30 years.
Right.
And kudos to him for doing it that long and keeping to it. So, with me, I was a huge cheerleader of AA.
Yeah.
Because I believed in a higher power, and that part wasn't hard. I never felt like anyone pushed Jesus on me, because that was the part where I was like, okay, this is my boundary.
Yeah, yeah.
I kind of shunned religion and felt like it was a bunch of bull.
Yeah.
If there was a Jesus, this is not what he would have wanted.
Yeah.
From this, that
exactly.
type of thing.
Yeah.
So that kind of all rolled around, and I started I was continuing to go to meet. I was going to every single meeting of my home group 3 days a week. I hate to say religiously, but religiously.
Yeah.
And that was my church, so to speak.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And in fact, just to comment about that briefly, I think one of the most important things about recovery and what the 12 steps provide is a sense of community.
Yes.
In many ways, you've isolated yourself in your addiction. I know that drinking can be a social thing, but it also, when it's into real addiction, you're doing it, you're isolating yourself. And so,
absolutely.
So one of the major things that has to happen when you get into recovery is to start building community with other people. And my argument is, the humanist argument is, that it is that connection between human beings. You happen to share a substance abuse past and a recovery future, but it's that connection of human beings that really is the magic.
Yes.
That is beneficial for everyone that's involved.
And, it's not just recovery from drugs and alcohol. It's just life. I'm an introvert.
Yeah.
So my favorite thing is not going into situations with a group of strangers and introducing myself. This is comfortable to me.
Right.
Getting in a room and my particular home group was very popular. So our home group had about at least 100 members.
Okay.
And at any given meeting, we had 30 to 50 people there, which was pretty big. Some of the other meetings in the area, 10, 15, 20 at the most. Mm-hmm. So that was nice, and that was intimidating at first. We had a Saturday morning meeting at 8 a.m. And I remember the very first time I went to that meeting, I'm like, I did not expect this many people to show up at an 8 o'clock meeting on a Saturday.
Yeah.
And one guy said to me, well, there's a lot of drunks around here, or something like that. Yeah. So when I first started realizing, I'm going to give this a try. I'm going to try to replace higher power with something else. The group, technically the group was was more powerful than I was by myself. And then I tried to think of it that way. But unfortunately, the more and more meetings I went to, the more I realized when people say higher power, they really are talking about this entity that I couldn't help but think about the God I was raised with, this entity in the sky looking down on us, who adores us and is worried about us. And when we pray to him, he listens, and that type of thing. And I just couldn't get that out of my head. So I started looking up some alternatives. There's, it's called SOS, but it's changed its meaning. Secular something of sobriety.
Okay.
It's got a little lifesaver as its logo, part of its logo. And then there were a couple others, but the one I honed in on was SMART Recovery.
Okay. The
acronym stands for self-management and something. I can look it up.
We'll put a link in the show notes, so we'll get the details out to the listeners.
Perfect, thank you. There's a whopping one meeting in my area. So that literally there's, I live in an area where there's at least 500,000 people in three major cities. And it's a smorgasbord of AA meetings. You could go to any AA meeting pretty much any time of day you wanted.
Right.
And there's one SMART meeting in my area. So that's a little frustrating. So I'm going from 3 meetings to 1, and I'm good with it. Sometimes I miss it, but for the most part, I go to that one meeting and I enjoy it. There's crosstalk. We try to chat with each other about our experiences that week and what went on, what frustrated us. Did we have a thought about drinking? Did we not? And did we use the principles that, they have different principles about, for example, a hierarchy of values. They urge you to write down your hierarchy of values. And then, if you did have a full-blown urge to drink, whip that thing out and say to yourself, this is what I stand to lose.
Right.
If I were to decide to drink again. So things like that are just based on scientific evidence of things that work as far as rational behavior and emotive behavioral therapy and that sort of thing.
Right.
And it makes sense and it works, and it's a smaller group, and we've kind of gotten to know each other, and that's kind of nice. But one of the things that you said that really struck me was the word community. Mm-hmm. And I remember right around that same time frame in early 2018, I was watching some episodes of Intervention, which we tend to do. I was trying to avoid the ones about alcohol. This one was a special that they had done about the heroin triangle north of Atlanta.
Okay.
And someone in one of the episodes said that connection is the opposite of addiction.
Yes.
And I loved that. I don't know who said it first, but gosh, I really hang on to that. I really, regardless of whether you're in AA, I mean, to me, if AA works for you, do it.
Right.
The fact that you can go to a group of people like that and they understand you, they understand the shitty thoughts that you're having.
Right.
And, why would you want to drink again after all the mess you made? And you're like, you don't get it.
Yeah, and even I appreciate that, I feel like I have a close enough understanding of what addiction is like, and yet I still know there's this gulf between what, my intellectual understanding and the reality of what that must be like. So I recognize I'm a normie.
Yep, absolutely.
But yeah, definitely the point about community and why that it ties into deconversion and just being a secular person is that very similarly, for people who were a major part of church, they had a community, a built-in community. And then when they begin to have doubts about that, they're no longer welcome there, and they find themselves outside of community. And obviously, I think it sounds like you found some of that community in the YouTube community, and there's a pretty thriving online environment for atheists and agnostics. What is challenging is finding, like what you described, just one meeting finding a real life in-person kind of connection is still a thing that I think we need to work on.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, even as an introvert, I highly recommend people just step outside of those comfort zones. Recently, I discovered that if I get, I guess a misconception about introverts is that we don't like people, and that's not it at all. I mean, I think sometimes we joke about it,
Yeah.
but when we are around too many people too often, we need a break. And the break is me time.
Yeah.
Whereas extroverts are the opposite. If they don't like to be alone too long, and then they derive their energy from being around others. And so for me, I've recently realized that blatantly. And so, go ahead and do your me time,
Right.
and then go to the meeting, and then I think you can really get much more out of it that way. But definitely reach out to others. I just don't think, I think you're really decreasing your chances of recovery when you do it alone. When
Yeah.
if you think you could do it on your, by yourself. For me, it's not just been a matter of stopping drinking. It's not just that. I mean, AA had the phrase, quitting drinking isn't just about quitting drinking, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that. I believe it's for me anyway, it's deeper seated than just, stopping the habit.
Yeah.
I've discovered things about myself this late in life that I just never knew. And I'm glad that I at least discovered it,
Right.
because like I said, I kind of alluded to the fact that I have a sibling who, she's 9 years older than me, and she may never figure it out.
Yeah.
And there's plenty of people out there who may never figure it out, but there's things about me that I've worked on, and I'm learning to cope with not just real life, everyday stuff that happens that pisses me off.
Yeah.
Traffic is a perfect example of that. You get mad at someone and you're raging. But the unusual things, the things that don't happen every day, you do have deaths in the family.
Yeah.
Everyone has that, and that's normal, but it certainly doesn't happen every day, for an individual. And
Yeah.
so things like that, that aren't worth drinking over. Learning how to cope with those things in a calm, mature manner.
Mm-hmm.
Gosh, I've learned so much. There's still plenty of stuff to work on.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I've learned so much.
So what's interesting about my story is I came to Christianity in my late teens when my mom got clean and sober.
Mm.
So my kind of first contact with any formal spirituality, quote unquote, was 12 steps. And then I got to church.
Ah, interesting.
12 steps really, really influenced my perspective on Christianity. And then now that it's been 3 or 4 years now of becoming an atheist and recognizing that still there's some things there that are still valuable. And one of the things that leapt out to me when I first saw you on a couple of YouTube videos, as you did a video on honesty.
Yeah.
And again, I find these to be just deeply humanistic values. The ideas of really brutal self-honesty.
Oh, yeah.
Doing a rigorous personal inventory.
Right.
These are things that, people don't just come up with those ideas on their own, right? You kind of have to be shown that, led through that. And yet these can be really profoundly life-altering values and processes that a person goes through.
Yeah.
Are there things that you feel that, and for lack of a better term, that are still kind of spiritual, quote unquote, values that you gained from recovery process that as a secular person that you try to continue to keep in practice?
I'll be honest, I don't meditate like I should, but I think meditation is becoming an acceptable way of, there's so many like hip catchphrases to use. I would say being grounded, keeping some balance in your life. When you want, sometimes when you want to fly off the handle, get angry at something in the heat of the moment, and just being able to remind yourself to step back, take a few breaths. If you practice the meditation regularly, then it's easier in those heated moments, those quick moments, to be able to calm yourself down quicker.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a big proponent of, it's okay to have a pity party. Just don't have it for too long.
Right.
Some people might say don't ever have one, but I think there's a fine line between recognizing, and I think this is very important for men too, recognizing that it's okay to have emotions. And for men, other than anger. You've been taught that it's okay to get angry. Men in general in our culture, and probably every culture around the world practically, aren't taught that it's okay to cry. It's okay to be sad. It's okay to be embarrassed.
Yeah.
It's okay to have those emotions.
Can I tell you a quick story real quick? Yeah, so
yes.
This is pertinent. So again, I was probably 16 at the time. My mom gets clean and sober, or in the process, and we wind up going to the Betty Ford Center. So they do a family counseling session where my mom's counselor had me come in, sit me down, we're chatting, and they say, David, why don't you tell your mom what you're angry about? And I'm like, oh, I'm not angry.
Interesting.
So this was my problem that I had to work out, was that it wasn't until much later in life, and really mom's fourth and fifth relapse, but where this rage, this just absolute rage.
Wow.
And it was this moment in time where I remembered that conversation with the counselor, and just like, oh, this is my dysfunction. I've been holding back this anger at mom. I had my best friend would say, you can make fun of David that he's short. You can make fun of his maniacal laugh, but you can't make fun of his mama.
Oh yeah.
You know what I mean? And I just, all of that hit me all at one time, of just, I've been protecting her even into my adulthood, even after I'd long since, moved away, wasn't an active part of that dysfunction. I was still holding on to that. So it's not just anger that we can't, sometimes we can't even express the anger itself. So,
oh, sure. Absolutely.
I definitely agree. Speaking in generalizations, men, we often do not express emotion well.
That's a really good point, because I remember being angry for years, even in my teens, and not knowing why I was so angry. Like I couldn't put my finger on it. And I still, have trouble with a little bit of that. But yeah, just, it's okay to have these emotions, just dwelling on them, letting them take over your life, feeling like, hey, I deserve a drink over this, or this will help me relax, or whatever. I'm not saying that people who have drinks and relax afterwards, that's bad. But the difference between you and me is that I'll just keep going, and you'll stop after 2 and be fine. So yeah, so that's something that has really struck me about, my recovery process. And I may not have learned that if it weren't for AA. So I have gotten plenty of valuable things from AA. Someone at Smart Recovery jokes that AA is a great 8-step program.
Yes,
so I
exactly.
guess take away the steps that have to do with, giving yourself up to a higher power, and then you're fine.
Right.
But yeah, there's a lot of good stuff.
And things like making amends, recognizing how people that you've hurt, and then going and actually doing something about it. I mean, that is, and again, I hate that we don't have a good word for this, but that is good spiritual practice.
Yeah.
As a human being, right? To recognize where you've been wrong.
Absolutely. And frankly, I one of the things I learned too is, if that person doesn't accept your amends, that's on them. Like, you're not, you did your part, you apologize, you asked them if there was anything you could do to make up for it, and you open that door, and you, and moving forward, you continue to refrain from using. And that's what shows them that you're sincere. But if for some reason they say no, then that's on them, and then they have to figure that out. That's, you don't own that baggage.
Right.
So that's another thing that I really liked, even with AA, is that they made that clear to me that, you're not a doormat. Like, you're apologizing, and you're owning up to absolutely, rightful things that you need to own up to. But you're not the only one that makes mistakes either.
Yeah, yes, exactly. So, yeah.
Yeah.
So I know that your YouTube channel is called How Not to Be an Asshole. Yes. And if I'm not mistaken, correct me if I get it wrong, but there's a saying in AA that if you were an asshole before recovery, you'll be an asshole in recovery, that it's not a personality change.
Right. Yeah.
Tell me what the inspiration for that is.
Yes.
And what you're trying to accomplish there.
Sure. I try to address this in all of my videos and make it clear that my motivation is sort of threefold. To reach out to people who really are struggling with substance abuse, to reach out to people who may not be struggling with substance abuse, but they know they want to change in their lives. Mm-hmm. And then to people who just think I'm full of shit. And I would be absolutely open to hearing ideas that they have, because I'm not a psychologist. I don't Sure. pretend to be. I'm just trying to share what I've learned that I think is valuable. And I try my very best to just make suggestions, to not say this is the way to go, to not say that, clinical studies have shown that.
Right. I really believe that being honest on camera or on a podcast like this, when you can kind of be vulnerable, I guess is the right word. You can be vulnerable to people about your experience, that has the most profound impact on people. They can then hear it. Their defenses are not up. They're not being attacked, and they can hear, oh, that person, you went through something similar to me, and this is the lesson that you learned, right?
Right.
I really commend you on that. I think that is a very powerful way of communicating.
Well, I appreciate that. I never plan out my videos. The most planned out I've ever been was the video I did about the 12 steps and mm-hmm. how you could convert them into a secular aspect. Mm-hmm. And of course I had to have the steps out, to talk about them. But that was it. I really tried to just speak off the cuff as though I were speaking to a friend. I try my best to make it brief because I love telling stories.
Yeah.
When I was going to AA, like I said already, there's a lot of things that I really got out of it. And many times we joked, and I joked, and I think people agreed with me that, there's plenty of people in my life who aren't addicts that could use this, who could use these suggestions.
Yes.
So that's where that came from. And it was kind of also in part with a guy who was at my IOP. And I kind of alluded to that earlier, the intensive outpatient program, that's what that stands for. And he said early on, you're all just a bunch of assholes trying to blah, blah, blah. And I was like, how dare he? I'm like, I've done some assholery. And maybe that counts. But so that's really where that came from is I didn't necessarily want the channel to focus completely on recovery from, substance abuse. But so that's kind of where that started. And, there's plenty of people out there, I think, that are looking for those connections like we talked about. Mm-hmm. And, to let them know that, I felt like I was struggling way before I even started abusing alcohol.
Okay.
I just felt like a misfit, and I never mm-hmm. understood, kind of what I was alluding to before. I had job after job. I would after a year and a half, I would quit. After a year and a half, there were rumblings that someone was going to get let go, and this, that, and the other. And I was just a serial job getter. I would go there. I would like it the first 2 or 3 months, and then all of a sudden something would happen. And like I said, I'm still not 100% sure what it is that I do or say that kind of rubs people the wrong way. But, I've discovered now that something, number one, working on this YouTube channel might be a good idea.
Yeah.
But I do have another hustle on the side where I don't have to sit at a desk. I work out of my home. I meet new people all the time. Mm-hmm. And when I meet them, I walk away and I don't ever have to see them again. And so it's pretty cool. And so I like learning those things about myself, even though I feel like it's kind of late in life. I could go another 40 years and be a much better person than I was 5 years ago.
Yeah.
So that's a good thing, but.
And it's an ongoing process, this thing called humanity.
Right. I mean, and I make that point too, that, I'm on this journey. I'm not perfect. I make mistakes. The other day, for example, I was on my way to the grocery store, and this lady had stopped at an intersection where she had the right of way. She didn't have to stop.
Mm-hmm.
There were, two stop signs on the other side. And so I gave her a little honk, like encouraging her, go, you don't have to stop. And I parked my car, and as I'm entering the grocery store, she's behind me, and she says, "Excuse me, were you the lady who honked at me?" And I said, and at first I played dumb.
Yeah.
And I was like, I don't know, which was kind of a silly thing to answer. And she started going off on me about how rude I was. And I was thinking, just because you're sensitive doesn't mean that I did anything wrong.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I should have walked away, but I didn't. We were yelling at each other in the grocery store, which is very uncharacteristic of me, but I am not good at standing up for myself.
Yeah.
And so I knew that this is an opportunity that I have to take. And I may not say the right things, and doing it this way may not have been right, but for my personal edification, this is something that I needed to move forward, and maybe I'll have better words next time if, God forbid, I get into that situation again. But, so that's a perfect example of, I'm fallible. I shouldn't have handled it that way, perhaps, but on the other hand, it was good for me.
Yeah.
And so, just getting better at things, giving yourself a break, loving yourself. I'm huge. There's two main things that I would love for people to do of all stripes, particularly addicts, of course, but all people, I think, just need to love themselves more. And that's not an arrogant thing. That's, taking care of yourself, knowing what you need, giving yourself that thing, especially if someone else in your life can't or won't give it to you, and resilience. When you do encounter these tough things, bouncing back from them as quickly as possible. Like I said, you could have a little small pity party at some point, but bounce back, come back, and learn whatever you can learn from it and do it again.
Very well said.
Thanks.
I'm aware of our time is running out here, so I want to make sure to give you an opportunity to plug the service that you provide. So, so tell people about the YouTube channel. How can they reach you on Twitter or Facebook, anywhere that you're interested in?
Yeah, I'm a little all over the place right now, so I'm trying my best to figure that part out. But on YouTube, I'm How Not to Be an Asshole, and unfortunately, because it's not popular yet, it's not one of the first things that jumps up. So you may have to filter it for channel versus video.
Okay.
And then once you see the channel pop up, then you'll see it.
and we will have a link in the show notes for it. So.
Great. I also have a blog. So every time I do an episode, I try my best to mirror that with a blog. And sometimes it's mostly because there's things that I wish I had said in the video that I forgot. And so I follow that up with that. On Twitter, I am Secular Sobriety. And I think it's actually at HPNC Anonymous. So HP stands for High Point, which is the city I live in.
Oh, okay.
NC is North Carolina because that's my state. And Anonymous originally was for Alcoholics Anonymous. I also have another handle where I get more political, and that's at Iona Moxie, IONAMOXIE.
I don't think I'm following that one, so I'll have to go.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah, I picked that because Iona was the name of the character in Pretty in Pink.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
The woman who owned the record store.
Yeah.
I really envied her because I just felt like she had a lot of gumption to be, in her 30s or 20s or whatever she was, and dress up so audaciously that she did, and it was different every time. I just love that about her. And Moxie, of course, being what it is, just
a virtue.
Yeah, trying my best to just, be more of a outspoken person, especially when it comes to important things.
Yeah. Well, Lisa, I'll have to have you back on. We can talk about being introverts for hours, I'm sure.
Ironically.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Oh, I appreciate it. Thanks.
Some final thoughts on the episode. I really appreciate Lisa's honesty. A theme of the podcast is an honesty contest and brutal self-honesty. Self-honesty is a core value of the recovery process, and I would argue a life value. The concept of an unexamined life being incomplete is appropriate here. In this case, I think Jesus was right. The truth will set you free. I appreciate Lisa's approach as she tries to apply these things not only to her own recovery, but as well as to life in general. How do we live well? And that's really the humanistic goal. So I highly encourage you to check out Lisa's YouTube channel, see her videos, see what she has to say. Find her on Twitter. We'll have the links in the show notes for all of those things. I want to thank Lisa for being on the podcast and telling her story. And now for a personal note. I am the adult child of an alcoholic and a drug addict. If you've been listening to the podcast for any length of time, you'll notice that my mother comes up in the conversation quite often, and there's a reason for that. The details of my mom's story and her addiction are a soap opera that I won't go into the details of here. The Reader's Digest version is this. She abused alcohol and hard drugs for most of her life. At around the age of 36, when I was 16, she got clean and sober for approximately 10 years. After that 10-year period, she went back to her addiction and ultimately is a statistic in the opioid crisis. She used prescription medications and ultimately died of her disease. Why this is so impactful for me is that my Christianity is tied up in my mother's recovery story. When I was about 16, she came to me and said that she had seen Jesus. She had a literal epiphany. And that God had told her that she needed to choose whether to live or die. And she chose to live. Now, I have complicated feelings about this now, because for the next 10 years, she was in fact clean and sober. Whatever that experience was, it helped her to start the recovery process. Unfortunately, that recovery didn't last for the rest of her life, and she returned to her disease. But at the time, needless to say, watching your mother transform almost overnight is a rather convincing experience. And so my early faith was always in light of this miraculous experience that I witnessed. Early on, I was heavily influenced by Mom's recovery, so some of the first spirituality in my life was really 12-step based. The idea of being brutally honest was just a core value that I picked up very, very early in my spiritual discovery. And it is a value that I maintain till today, and it influences my humanism. Since the end of the story is not a happy one, I'm certain that some believers will say, aha, David was damaged by the loss of his mother, and that's why he's an atheist today. And in fact, I remained a Christian for many, many years after Mom went back to her addiction. And before she died, I became an atheist as I began to understand that it just wasn't true. The self-honesty, that core value, the thing that led me into Christianity, the thing that I found compelling about the story of Jesus and his teachings, is the exact thing that led me out. When I was honest with myself about what I felt was true and what wasn't true, I had to acknowledge I had no proof, I had no objective reason to believe that something like the resurrection occurred. And if that didn't happen, then just like Paul says, we are of all men most to be pitied. And I had to let it go. It was the truth that set me free. And so you see, I think there's a very strong parallel between recovery from substance abuse or family systems and deconversion. It is the breakdown or the acknowledgement of cognitive dissonance and coming to terms with reality. I want to know if this is a subject that people are interested in hearing about. If you're an adult child of an alcoholic or drug addict, or if you're a substance abuser yourself in recovery or otherwise, if you've gone through the deconversion process and you are trying to work through all of those things all at the same time, I'd like to hear from you. You can leave me a voicemail on the anchor.fm site, or you can email me at gracefulatheist@gmail.com, or hit me up on Twitter @gracefulatheist. Time for some footnotes. The song is a track called Waves by Micaiah Beats. Please check out her music. Links will be in the show notes. If you'd like to help support the podcast, here are the ways you can go about that. First, help promote it. The podcast audience grows by word of mouth. If you found it useful or just entertaining, please pass it on to your friends and family. Post about it on social media so that others can find it. Please rate and review the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. This will help raise the visibility of our show. Join me on the podcast. Tell your story. Have you gone through a faith transition? You want to tell that to the world? Let me know and let's have you on. Do you know someone who needs to tell their story? Let them know. Do you have criticisms about atheism or humanism, but you're willing to have an honesty contest with me? Come on the show. If you have a book or a blog that you want to promote, I'd like to hear from you. Also, you can contribute technical support. If you are good at graphic design, sound engineering, or marketing, please let me know and I'll let you know how you can participate. And finally, financial support. There will be a link on the show notes to allow contributions which would help defray the cost of producing the show. If you want to get in touch with me, you can Google Graceful Atheist, or you can send email to gracefulatheist@gmail.com. You can tweet at me @gracefulatheist, or you can just check out my website at gracefulatheist.wordpress.com. Get in touch and let me know if you appreciate the podcast. Well, this has been the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Grab somebody you love and tell them how much they mean to you. This has been the Graceful Atheist Podcast.